But this next part is, like, shocking, and people should have been way more upset about what had happened. I think Wendy was pretty annoyed by this, but everybody else is, like, acting like it's just the cutest, and, oh, what a funny thing. You know, thank goodness nothing bad happened. But I'm sitting here going, like, what? She says the next day both boys went out all morning with Edward for another shooting expedition. Unfortunately, I very nearly got caught in the crossfire. Has nobody taught these people about gun safety? As I was walking back to the lodge after clearing up the breakfast things, I heard a shot go off above my head. Darting for cover, I came across the prince walking around the side of the house with Emily Van Cutsum, chuckling at the near miss. He strode purposefully round the front of the house and shouted, "Hold your fire, men! Wendy wants to get home!" "Bloody hooligans," he laughed. What kind of a gun is this? Is this a BB gun? I mean, maybe that's why it's all just like ha 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 ho ho ho. Wendy almost got shot in the head. But this seems kind of like not the way we should be dealing with guns. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're going to be doing the last 3 chapters from the Housekeepers Diary. Now, these are not super long chapters, so we're going to kind of go through them fairly quickly, I think, but enough of my yapping here at the beginning. If you would do me a favor, and before we even get started, if you would just hit the like button, that helps more people find the video. I know they're always telling you this. I know every video you've ever watched, you get the, if you'll hit the like button, if you'll subscribe. It's like, I know what to do. I've been on YouTube a couple of times, you know, and I personally am like, okay, get past your little spiel. I know. But if you really would just do me the favor of hitting the like button, that really truly does help. And if you're enjoying these videos, if you would just consider sending them to a friend who you think would also enjoy this style of video, that'd be awesome. Later this week, we're going to be starting the Kennedy book. I have so many thoughts about that book. I read it while I was at the beach last week. Big thoughts, you guys. And we'll be talking about that later. So if you think that, if you have a friend who likes to hear the Kennedy dirt, who you think would enjoy a series like that, go ahead and send them this way to the channel so they'll be ready and they will see that first video when it drops later this week. Okay, on to what we're doing right now. Last 3 chapters. This first chapter we're reading today, it's chapter 17. It's called Public Relations. It begins by saying, unprecedented tantrums by the Prince of Wales that month suggested that, like Diana, he too was beginning to crack under the pressure of a highly unsatisfactory marriage. Both Charles and Diana were off to Europe for a couple of days. Charles to Berlin, Diana to Budapest. The prince was leaving from Highgrove, and the princess from London. And an early morning phone call from Diana to her husband had put him in the foulest of moods. He'd taken the call shortly after 8:30 a.m. in the dining room and slammed the phone down in disgust a few minutes later. Then, pacing up and down in his bedroom, he had attempted, unsuccessfully, to dress himself in the stiff uniform of one of his regiments. Ken Stronach, who would usually have helped Charles with the trickier studs and buttons, had flown on to Berlin in advance, leaving Charles cursing and stamping his feet like a spoilt schoolboy. When he did eventually descend the stairs, Paul said how smart he looked in his uniform, which led to another explosion. "No, I don't. It's horrible. I hate it. It's so uncomfortable," screamed Charles before rushing up to his bedroom again. Seconds later, the phone went in the pantry. "I want Ken," he shouted. "I don't believe it. Where are my special bloody cufflinks? Ken should know by now not to pack everything and leave me stranded by myself." Paul, who was holding the receiver away from his ear at arm's length, timidly offered to come up and help. "No!" screamed Charles. "No, no, no! I want Ken!" The phone went dead. Well, Ken ain't here, man. He's in Berlin, so it's a tough life. I had barely seen him in such a temper, and we crept around the house, doing our duties as quietly as possible. Charles was not due to leave until 10:15 a.m., and fortunately by the time I had walked upstairs to check the linen cupboard, he'd calmed down sufficiently to have a more civil conversation. He passed me on the deep pile green carpet, looking hot and bothered and ferocious. Suddenly he stopped, and actually apologized. "I'm so sorry about this morning," he said rather meekly. "It's been a bit of a difficult morning." And then, as he started to walk down to his waiting car, he added, "Thanks a million, Wendy. I know how hard you will work for me." And as Wendy says, it quite transformed the day. Unlike Diana, who could be sullen and moody for weeks, Charles' tantrums were a storm in a teacup. Up in the air, screaming with rage one minute, he could normally be relied on to be back on ground level within the hour. And the fact that he had apologized and seemed truly embarrassed about his behavior showed a more balanced character than his wife. I wished him a good trip, and Charles thanked me with a smile and a wave as he left. I really feel like if somebody can hold themselves and apologize, I really don't know that there's much in me that finds a need to hold a grudge. If somebody can just come to me and be like, hey, I acted like an ass, and I'm really sorry. Will you forgive me? Yeah, of course. Like, does a day go by when I don't act like an ass? I mean, like, I feel like it's easy for me to forgive if the other person will at least humble themselves. And I feel like for Charles's staff, to have him come and say, I'm sorry, when, I suppose technically you could say he didn't have to. I think as a human being he did, but, maybe by the rules he didn't have to say he was sorry. But for him to humble himself would really have just kept everything on an even keel in his household. Diana's constant desire to hold power by being moody and mean really meant that she lost power. Because when you treat people like dirt, they don't respect you, and they might do what you say, but there's always this sense of like mutiny under everything, and like sort of a disregard for what happens to you, Diana, because it's like, well, she's kind of terrible. So if you want to keep the loyalty of your staff, like humble yourself and say you're sorry. And Charles at least knew that much. Friends of mine who stayed at the lodge would often be intrigued to come across the prince on his knees in the mud. One Saturday in early April, I had a house full, and we all decided to go for a walk. As we skirted the house, one of my guests pointed to a disheveled-looking man, head bowed in the drizzle, pulling out weeds from a herbaceous border. "Does the prince have gardeners here all the time?" she asked. "Can't they go inside when it rains?" I looked across and saw who the gardener was. She was quite shocked when I told her it was Prince Charles. "Gosh, I hope he didn't hear me," she giggled. "Fancy me thinking Prince of Wales was a gardener." It's okay, someone thought Jesus was a gardener once too. Charles would retreated more and more into his garden when he stood at Highgrove, as it was the only source of comfort that he could find. On some days he looked quite desperately sad as he paced around digging and weeding, barely saying a word to anyone. "Look at him," Paul said. "All he thinks about is the wretched garden." He sounded just like the princess. Well, he would, Paul and the princess being hand in glove half the time. Charles and Diana were not together again at Highgrove until William's exit from Ludgrove on Friday, May 8th. And then the couple barely exchanged a word. Charles busy with his polo, and Diana taking the boys back to London before he had a chance to speak to them. It had been quite a heartbreaking Saturday. The prince had not arranged to play at Chukka until that afternoon at Cowdrey Park, and had arrived at breakfast that morning expecting to see William and Harry. After half an hour, he rang through the pantry and asked where the boys were, to be told by Paul that they had both been having breakfast with their mother in the nursery. As Charles got up from the dining room, he bumped into Diana and the boys heading for the back door, both children clutching their water pistols and dressed in their army gear. "Where are you going?" said Charles. "We're going back to London. What does it look like?" snapped Diana, as she bundled the boys into the car. The princess had obviously hoped to smuggle the boys away without her husband realizing, and so as not to upset them, Charles appeared to take the decision to avoid a traumatic scene. "This is ridiculous, Diana," he said quietly, his voice laced with anger. "What on earth are you playing at?" "We're going to London. Why don't you get ready for your precious polo?" she replied curtly. Later that morning, Charles left with his detective, spending the night away from Highgrove at a private address. You guys, you know how I feel about this? You know how I feel about it. Oh, my voice is kind of messed up after screaming and pretending to be Charles. I can't handle the way she does with her kids. I can't. I hate it. It's wrong. And to try to sneak the boys away so their dad would be looking for them around the house. Where are the kids? Where are the kids? I thought we were having a weekend with the kids. Oh, the kids are gone. Your wife took them when you weren't looking. Sorry, it's a big house. I mean, it's like, what the heck? How could you remain sane under those conditions? No wonder Charles getting a little bit snappy about the cufflinks because, I mean, he's got bigger fish to fry. But still, it's like the small things would really grate on you in that atmosphere. With both Charles and Diana away, I began to take stock of how badly I was being affected by all the problems at Highgrove and the hours required of me. I had already passed my 60th birthday, and the last thing I needed as I crept around Highgrove at 7 a.m. was a couple in the throes of a bitter marriage wrangle. Sad though such breakups are for parents and children concerned, the disintegration of a royal marriage spreads an altogether wider net. The people who are on call for the royals at all times are affected just as badly as blood relations, sometimes more considering the loyalty the prince and his family inspire in people. I seriously wondered about throwing in the towel. I was not confident that I could manage on my savings, however, and as the office at St. James Palace had asked me to stay on for at least another couple of years, I resigned myself to the situation. Who knows, I thought to myself. It could just be another bad patch that they're going through, another baby perhaps, and everything will be back on an even keel. But of course it wasn't to be. I really, I like Wendy. But she is convinced, this is the fourth time she's been like, if they could just have another kid, everything would be fine. And I'm like, Wendy, when has having another kid solved anything? Maybe in this financial bracket, when you have somebody to kind of care for the kids and it's not actually the burden that parenting can sometimes be when it's all on you and your spouse, maybe under those conditions, another kid would be a good thing. But first of all, we don't have kids so we can keep ourselves in our marriage. A child is not born with a purpose to hold you and your sorry spouse together, So already that's kind of jacked up. But even if it could work under these circumstances with a nanny kind of carrying most of the weight and you just get to hold the cuddly little thing and, you don't really have to worry about training it or disciplining it because the nanny will do it. Even under those situations, I just feel like that's a terrible reason to have a kid because you're like, we're not getting along. It doesn't matter if the nanny is taking most of the weight, the child's still born under this umbrella of, we don't want to get a divorce, so come on into our broken, jacked up family. Maybe you can be the glue that holds us all together. What? No. Okay, but anyway, that's Wendy's perspective, and she feels pretty seriously that would have helped because this is the fourth time she said it. Anyway, the prince and princess had attended Expo 92 in Spain on May 21st. The pictures of them both looking bored and resentful flashed across the world, proving to everyone what we had kept a secret for so many years. They can't even be bothered to put on a show now, said Paul, shaking his head slowly as he looked at the morning papers. The picture showed them sitting on adjoining chairs at a public ceremony, but they were thousands of miles apart. The gulf that separated them in private was finally showing in public. Whatever their press spokesman suggested, nothing would change the public's interpretation of those shots. The game was up. There was no use in their pretending anymore. For the sake of the children, Charles and Diana took the boys to the Isles of Sicily for a few days after the Spanish fiasco, Charles returning to Highgrove a day before the princess flew into London. The following day, he invited Lord Romsey over for supper. He was one of the prince's closest friends, and usually the two men were light-hearted and relaxed together. That bank holiday evening, on May 25th, however, Romsey and the prince appeared subdued and somber. There had been rumblings in the press about a forthcoming biography of Diana that promised to paint the true picture of her troubled marriage to Prince Charles. The two men had a drink together on the terrace after having supper inside in the sitting room. They stayed up late discussing something so secret that they spoke in whispers behind closed doors. That night Lord Romsey stayed in the green room, joining the prince for breakfast. Neither looked as if they had slept very well. Let's just wait and see what happens, Charles, said Lord Romsey as he left that morning, thanking Paul and me for looking after him. Things might not be as bad as feared. But of course they were far worse than anyone could have feared. Okay, so now we're going to come to the Andrew Morton book. Public revelations, indeed, as this chapter would state, and it's really things went straight to hell in a handbasket at this point. What could have once been a situation that they maybe could have come back from, potentially, probably not, but there was still some hope. It's over now. Now that she's got a book written about her and all of her lies, and she's got her friends talking to the press, and, she's looking up through her eyelashes, being this sort of sad little innocent who has just been sinned against constantly and continually. Anyway, Charles had been fed information through his press office about likely revelations in the new royal biography, and it sent him into what can best be described as a panic. Eric and Poppy Anderson were asked over for dinner on May 29th. They spent hours locked away with the prince in the sitting room despite its being a gloriously hot day outside. No one knew quite what was going on, apart from the fact that the Sunday Times is due to publish a first installment of the Andrew Morton book on June 7th. Lord Romsey returned to Highgrove for another overnight stay at June 5th, and Charles and his friends, the interior designer Robert Kim and his wife Helen, stayed on Saturday night, which caused an awkward Sunday morning when the paper first appeared. Charles had arranged for his press secretary, Dickie Arbiter, to fax him the relevant pages as soon as they came out, and since the paper was deliberately held back, they were not sent until 5:26 a.m. on the Sunday morning. Dickie, a pleasant and jolly former radio reporter, apologized for the delay with the fax, and had obviously been up half the night waiting for the paper to arrive. That morning at breakfast, the photocopied and faxed pages were placed at the head of the dining table for the prince to look at. The atmosphere was not made any easier by there being guests around, and the conversation seemed a little stilted, to say the least. Diana was not down for more than a few minutes before she made an excuse and withdrew to her room. Is anybody else shocked that this is the time she decided to come on down? I mean, what of all... She's always there and ready for that breakfast tray. I'll just have a bed tray, please. Bring the food up to me, thank you. But when there's drama that she's drummed up, she's ready to take her place at that table. But the thing is that it's like, even she couldn't stand what she had done. I think that she wanted to be witness to it, thinking it was really going to be some kind of triumphant moment when she saw the dismay and the panic on Charles' face that she would betray him like this. But, of course, it didn't play out like her fantasy supposed that it would. Of course, she sat there in utter shame and dismay at what she had done, shame she hadn't expected to feel. Otherwise, she would never have shown her face at that breakfast table knowing those pages were going to be sitting there on his plate and there would be guests to witness his sadness. She was all rearing for the witness. She wanted there to be witnesses to it. But even as she sat there, the shame was too heavy and she had to get up and leave the table. Charles, however, stayed seated at the head of the table and read through all the material before getting up and going for a stroll around the garden with the Kims before they left. I was amazed by the prince's self-control, since the article was worse, far worse, than anybody had thought it would be. Several of us had, of course, seen the pages lying on the fax machine earlier that morning and had a chance to look through what had been written. In the staff areas, everyone spoke in a hushed whisper, not sure what to say or do. Several members of the staff loyally declared that they would never read the book or buy the Sunday Times again. But of course, as the day continued, others made excuses to go out and buy copies of the paper secretly. After seeing his guests off, Charles walked upstairs to the princess's room, carrying the faxes with him. Within minutes, Diana was running downstairs and out of the car, her face covered with a deep blush, her eyes brimming with tears. She was going back to London, she said, and dashed out of the door. Well, she should have been blushing. She should have been red with shame for what she had done. Look, no one is saying that she couldn't have been unhappy in her marriage. No one was saying, have that stiff upper lip, carry on, forget about your hardship, pretend it's not really happening, just go, go, go. No one's saying that, but you don't write a book about all of your problems, paint yourself as the innocent. There's absolutely zero reason to hang your dirty laundry out like this. And even worse, that you would be so brazen as to suggest that you had no part in it whatsoever when anybody who knew you played your own part. It's just shocking she thought she'd get away with it. I don't think she was mentally firing on all cylinders as far as just her mental wellness. But this really goes to show us how truly unwell she was, because for her to have written a book or been party to a book being written in which she's painted as this colossal innocent, when there was plenty of people who had witnessed an opposite side to her, how deranged must you be to think this was going to work out for you in your personal life? You can trick the masses, but you don't live with the masses. You live with the people who know that book was a lie. What was she thinking would happen? How did she, clearly she'd never sat down and thought, okay, let me play this out to its logical conclusion, which is what you have to do if you're sitting around thinking about making poor decisions. You might feel like you're empowered to make that poor decision, but sit down and play it out to its logical, honest conclusion. If you know how to be honest with yourself, you have to sit down and think, but what would really happen? I know this is what I want to happen. I know this is what I'm pretending will happen. What will really happen if I do this? She clearly had never done that. Charles, meanwhile, walked slowly around the garden by himself for over an hour before going upstairs to dress for polo. He did not return until much later that evening, and had obviously had more than his one glass of Pimm's after the match. For goodness sake, don't mention anything about the story, said Paul sternly to all of us. How stupid, I thought, as if anyone would. Sometimes Paul seems like he was a real pain in the neck. It was several weeks before I saw Diana again. The newspapers had been full of in-depth analytical pieces about who was behind the Andrew Morton book, and more importantly, why. When the princess arrived that Friday, she came with her detective, Dave Sharp, Evelyn Dagley, Harry, and his detective, Reg Spiney, and Chris Barber, the chef. Diana looked tense, but pleased to be out of the public spotlight, and said that she wanted a quiet weekend with Harry. The prince, she said, was not expected. According to our schedule, he was due that Saturday, but nonetheless, Diana was adamant that her information was correct. Because of this, she arranged another staff barbecue, and she asked Dave Sharp to organize it in the royal part of the garden. As David was preparing the charcoal, Ken Stronach suddenly pulled up in a household car and announced that the prince was due in 30 minutes. So you and your riffraff need to get out of that royal garden, go back over by the stables. That's where y'all can hang out. Diana looked at us darkly and went into the house as everything was transferred to the stable yard at the back of the house. Charles, however, had not come to stay, but only for a bath and a change of clothing. As Diana joined the rest of us, the prince, fresh and smelling of cologne, walked past the group and into the garden to pick a bunch of sweet peas. Ken told us that he was going out for a birthday party that evening and was not expected back at Highgrove until the following day. All eyes were on him as he walked up to Diana and took her quietly to one side. "I didn't think you were coming this weekend," he said with barely disguised hatred in his voice. "You told me, Diana, that you would not be here." With that, he walked purposefully back along the gravel path and into the house. Diana was more subdued than before when he had left and seemed unable to recover her equilibrium. She kept her eyes downcast throughout the rest of the evening, rushing inside to take a series of phone calls and then returning with red, puffy eyes. What is she playing at? Like, truly, when he asked her that earlier, same, bro, that's my question. What are you playing at? What is your purpose? Why are you telling him I'm not going to be at the house, showing up at the house, then telling the staff, oh, it's my weekend and he's not going to be here? But then he shows up like, what? Lying to this person, but the lies don't even make sense at this point. Leaving the party to take phone calls, coming back clearly distraught. Like, if your life is mayhem, you have written the script. Like, why are you shocked and surprised? You are the author of it. By turning up that evening, Charles had wrecked Diana's hopes of a peaceful weekend and had spoiled his own good mood as well. Each seemed as upset as the other that their visits had coincided. Diana was up early the next morning and left with Harry to collect William from school. It was his 10th birthday, and a party had been arranged for him in the King of Greece's garden in Hampstead Garden suburb. Charles planned to join them independently, and then go and play polo before spending the night alone at Highgrove. There must have been a special arrangement with Ledgrove School, because the princess took Harry over to see William again the following Sunday for a picnic. She and her son had stayed at Highgrove the night before, but Charles had not been around, which allowed her to relax in the pool and speak to friends on her mobile phone. Diana seemed brighter than the weekend before and was positively friendly as we chatted that Saturday afternoon in the kitchen. "William's a bit homesick," she confided. "I do worry about him so much." The old adage that when it rains it pours was never truer that weekend of Friday, July 3rd. The foal of the prince's favorite horse, Reflection, slipped in a hole in the paddock, breaking her leg, and had to be put down. Patty was in a terrible state, blaming the stockman for putting in cattle when they churned up the ground. The prince was beside himself with grief. The foal had been the first to be born at Highgrove. He demanded to hear all the details, but did not blame Patty, sending him a note the following day telling him not to hold himself responsible for the tragedy. Thus the arrival of Diana and the boys on the Saturday did little to raise Charles's spirits, and the atmosphere of pent-up tension was compounded by the arrival that evening of his friends Hugh and Emily Van Cutsum, who were going to the theater with him. Diana took William up to bed with her that night at 8 o'clock, both of them ordering a dinner tray and intending to spend the evening watching television. What is her obsession with holing up in her room with her kid? One of her kids, not even the other one, because he's too much to handle. But always with William. And no wonder William felt that he had to come to her defense, because she's over there, frankly, grooming him to be her defender. Spending all this private time with him, always taking him off to the side, and teaching him, though not with words, that I want to be around you. I'm making time for you. Your dad's somewhere out there. He's doing something out there. But I'm the one that's here for you. I want you. I want this time with us. We're together. It's you and me, and kind of giving him this impression that he has one parent that likes to spend time with him and one parent that doesn't like to spend time with him. But it isn't that Charles isn't wanting to spend time with William. He's just not going to be maniacal and manipulative and sort of orchestrate these little one-on-ones constantly, And as a child, though, you wouldn't necessarily be able to figure out the difference. That Sunday, there was another newspaper story causing concern to Charles, this time by one of Diana's masseurs, Stephen Twigg. Unlike the previous occasion when the princess had remained publicly silent about the Sunday Times serialization, she let out a gasp of horror at the new revelations. "I do think it's getting to be a bit too much, Diana," said Charles dryly, in what must be the understatement of the century. Are there any of your friends who are not talking to the newspapers?" Diana had been due to see Stephen Twigg for treatment that evening at Kensington Palace after attending the Wimbledon men's final. Evelyn was told to ring him up and cancel the appointment. As she left, Diana told me how inconvenient it was for her when people broke her trust. "It means I'm going to have to find someone else now," she said quietly. The fact that she was filling thousands of newspaper column inches worldwide thanks to a group of her friends talking to the writer did not seem either to occur to or bother her. Of course it doesn't bother her, because they're all giving the same sad sack story that she's trying to push forward. The prince and princess's public rift was now of great concern to the palace's old guard. Diana's grandmother and a close friend of the Queen Mother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, stayed overnight with Charles to discuss the situation. Lady Fermoy, by now frail and withdrawn, had been horrified by Diana's involvement in the book, and walked slowly round the garden with the prince. She, like everyone else, knew that the problems were now insoluble, and wanted to keep Charles through the crisis. Her visit appeared to comfort and help prepare the prince for the ultimate collapse of his marriage. He also took advice from his close friends Amanda and Gerald Ward, whose daughter Sarah worked in the St. James Palace office. Gerald was one of Charles's equerries, close enough to the prince to be able to talk candidly about private matters. Another source of comfort was the prince's mentor, Sir Lawrence Vanderpost, who paid several daytime visits to Charles at Highgrove. The two men walked for hours deep in conversation and also attended the theater together. I remember being fascinated by Sir Lawrence's craggy face and wispy white hair. I knew that the prince relied heavily on him, but as I looked at this deeply intelligent, wiry old man, I could not help worrying about how the prince would react when he was no longer around. Charles was at his lowest ebb, devastated by the publicity about his relationship with Diana, and needed constant support. Worse was to come with the publication of a taped conversation between Diana and her friend James Gilby, and at one stage we seriously wondered whether the prince would be able to carry on. The hotline between Highgrove and the Queen rang more often these days, and conversation frequently ended in sharp, acrimonious exchanges. Nonetheless, Charles' spirits had lifted a little by September, when Sarah Key made another visit to Highgrove for deep physiotherapy on his knee. She accompanied him to Balmoral and traveled with him around the country, bolstering his confidence and providing him with the perfect antidote to the shock of Diana's terrible breach of trust. "Let's get you completely fit again, sir," she would joke. "You're going to need to be in tip-top condition to pull through this one." What is Sarah Key to him? Does anybody wonder? I know that she's like a physical therapist, so I get that, and I'm not implying that there was anything more. I just feel like it's weird that he travels with her all the time, and that whenever she's around, he's like in a real good mood. I just, personally, I'm not one for massages. I find no joy in them. But if I did, I just can't imagine that I would travel with the person that gives me massages and that when they were around, they were lifting my spirits. I mean, if they're lifting my spirits, I feel like you're more than just my masseuse. I don't know. Okay, the next chapter is called Final Separation. Thank the Lord we're finally here. I mean, it's been a prolonged journey. But this first story is delicious. Diana was in floods of tears in her room. She had somehow heard about a tray of jewelry specially prepared for the prince to look over regarding his choice of Christmas presents that year, and had been mortified by the allocation of gifts. Whereas a diamond necklace had been marked down for Camilla Parker Bowles, she discovered to her horror that she was due to receive a collection of cheap paste jewels. I love it! I love it! I love that she's going to get some cheap paste jewels. That's what she deserves. That's the sort of wife she's been, and need I say it again? I know Charles was cheating on her. She was cheating on Charles. His whole marriage is a sham. I get it. But to have a book written in which you are the heroine, your husband is the wretch, the ogre that crawled out from some forest to drag you back to his lair, whereupon he began to cheat on you relentlessly day in and day out while he smashed your face into the necessity of you giving birth to some of his ogre children. And then just as you were crawling out the door, he dragged you back. Like this fantasy that she's created, I have no sympathy left for her. And I'm, quite frankly, the evil side of me is glad that she got a junkie present. Is that right? Probably not, but still. Well, Diana raged on. "I don't want his bloody fake jewels," she cried. "I thought cheating husbands took great care to keep their wives sweet with the real things, saving the tawdry stuff of their tarts." She was inconsolable and vowed bitterly that she would never be able to forgive Charles for anything. Yeah. What a shock he would do this. After you just smeared his reputation in horse feces, now you're wondering why in the world he wouldn't want to give you a superior Christmas present. Why? Why would he not, roll out the red carpet for you, Diana? You're right. This is a real stumper. I don't get it. The princess had run the gauntlet of bad publicity for several months, with the publication of an alleged tape of a conversation between her and a debonair second-hand car salesman called James Gilby. His name was not familiar to us at Highgrove, since he had never visited Diana as far as we knew at the house. That autumn, the princess pulled out of planned arrangements at the last minute, pleading exhaustion, and was generally ill at ease and vulnerable. We were surprised when on November 18th she announced that instead of joining the prince and his family at Sandringham, she would stay at Highgrove with William and Harry. This last-minute change of plans through the normally efficient staff rode into chaos, since instead of one chef on duty, 2 would now be needed, one for Charles and another for her. Paul, however, did not seem surprised and finally admitted that he had known of her decision for weeks. She told me she just couldn't face being with him, he explained. Things had got so bad now that she's not been able to be in the same house, let alone the same room with the prince. I've already said it once, but Paul's getting on my ever-loving nerve. He's really riding that last nerve of what I've got, because he just is like, oh, so you knew all along, did you, Paul? You want to give your friends a heads up? Maybe your fellow compatriots over here are slaving down in the kitchens, the lower staff. You want to let us know what's going on? Could have been nice. No. He just likes to walk around with his superior knowledge of the inside workings of the princess's confused mind. Harry had started at Ludgrove School with William, and both boys had an exit that weekend. On Thursday, November 19th, therefore, Diana and the boys drove straight to Highgrove, leaving the prince and his friends to enjoy a shooting weekend in Norfolk. Royal entertaining at Sandringham was more lavish than in any other household, and Chris Barber the chef seemed quite pleased to be away from it and back at Highgrove. Diana, too, appeared calm and reserved, happy to have her boys to herself. That Friday, Diana sat in the kitchen with William and Harry and chatted to Paul and me about her recent trip to Korea with the prince. Media coverage had shown a couple at war, and I was surprised that she brought the subject up in front of us and the boys.
I was so tired I could hardly cope, she admitted. The whole trip was really a mistake. No wonder I looked so miserable in the pictures.
Of course she brought it up to the staff because she knows the pictures were really childish and pathetic, that 2 grown adults could be seen feuding so obviously. 2 people who are married to each other and aren't separated yet, to be seen completely incapable of holding it together for a minute was an embarrassment. And so, of course, she's got to come back and paper over what they saw. Don't believe your lying eyes. You didn't see me unhappy in the papers. What that really was just me being really tired. That evening, the princess put the boys to bed and returned to the sitting room, where she and Paul spent nearly half an hour deep in conversation. Something's brewing, said Paul, as he came through the pantry. Can't quite put my finger on it, but I feel that we're on the verge of some terrible news. Of course, Paul wants to be the bearer of the news, just a tidbit for you lowlings who don't have the ear of the princess, but I'll let you guys know when you need to know. The next day, Diana had arranged for a special treat for William and Harry, and all her time was given over to her sons. A lorry turned up in the back courtyard in the pouring rain and deposited 2 motor-sized go-karts for the children to drive around the estate. Despite the weather, the young princesses jumped at the chance and were soon racing each other round the lanes, going at what seemed breakneck speeds in the appalling conditions. The princess shouted encouragement for the backyard, her wax jacket dripping with rain, her face flushed with excitement in the cold. Neither she nor the boys were bothered in the slightest by the weather, and all seemed reluctant to cut short the fun for lunch.
We'll have lunch all together in the staff dining room, said Diana excitedly as she helped me lay the table. Then we'll continue with the carts.
Isn't it interesting that somehow the rain doesn't bother her now that she's got some kind of little speedy car to send her children around in? If it's not just wild wacko fun, she can't have any part of it. They need to be going to fun fairs. They need to be riding recklessly in carts. There needs to be something wild and catchy and fun and up in your face, When Charles wants to spend a more quiet, reserved weekend doing, different things, like the time he wanted to go for a picnic and look at some of the churches in the countryside and look at the architecture with the boys and sort of teach them something culturally relevant. She had no time for that.
No, we were going to go to the fun fair. That's better, isn't it, boys? Nobody wants to go look at those old churches. Papa's crazy.
And now out in the rain in the go-karts. Look, I love go-karts. I'm not saying she can't have fun with her kids. Don't hear her being like, it can only be stodgy or it's not for the boys. Look, have a wild time in those go-karts. But I just wish that she could be more balanced. have fun with the go-karts in the rain. But if your husband wants to, take you guys up to Highgrove and the weather's not always to your liking, just be a good sport. It's her inability to be a good sport when it costs her something. That is the problem that I have. That lunchtime, the princess took great delight in serving us drinks and offering more food. She was like any other normal young mother, chatting informally with everyone there and appearing so natural that it must have come as a shock to the couple who had driven over with the go-karts. Chris did all the food and joined in with the fun. "I'm so glad I'm here rather than at Sandringham," he said to me and winked. "No bloody crudité today." That Sunday afternoon, after a blissful weekend, Diana and the boys came through the pantry to say goodbye. Although there was nothing extraordinary about this, I was surprised and troubled by what she said. After thanking Paul and me, she took us quietly to one side and continued,
"Whatever happens, I want you to know I've really enjoyed this weekend. It's been very important for me and for the boys."
With that, she shooed them into the car and drove them back to school. Paul and I looked at each other after we'd waved them off. "Something's brewing," he repeated suspiciously, "and God knows what's going to happen." The prince was still away in Sandringham when the phone rang on the internal line from St. James's Palace on Tuesday, December 8th. It was Lady Jane Strathclyde, the personal officer, saying that she would be coming to Highgrove the following day to tell us in person about an important statement. Jane, normally a gregarious and bubbly character, seemed strangely subdued and could not be drawn further on what the statement was going to reveal. However, Paul and I could guess. "It's over, Wendy, isn't it?" he said. "It's finished." I nodded, but I urged him not to say anything to Maria or anyone until we knew for sure. It seemed such a momentous decision to take that I could not quite believe it was happening. That evening, the Highgrove telephone lines were ringing with anxious staff from around the country wanting to find out if we knew the exact wording of the following day's statement. The palace had wanted to coordinate the announcement to staff so the news of the separation would be broken simultaneously to every household. But Jane Strathclyde had not arrived by the time the Prime Minister, John Major, stood up in the House of Commons to deliver the prepared text. She did ring, however, to break the news and apologize that she would be late. She told us that the Prime Minister would speak at 3:30 and that the announcement would be televised. So Paul, Maria, Lyda, and I waited anxiously in the staff dining room to hear the worst. All of us sat open-mouthed as John Major started to read the statement. "It is announced from Buckingham Palace that, with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate. Their Royal Highnesses have no plans to divorce, and their constitutional positions are unaffected. This decision has been reached amicably, and they will both continue to participate fully in the upbringing of their children. Their Royal Highnesses will continue to carry out full and separate programs of public engagements and will, from time to time, attend family occasions and national events together. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, though saddened, understand and sympathize with the difficulties that have led to this decision. Her Majesty and His Royal Highness particularly hope that the intrusions into the privacy of the Prince and Princess may now cease. They believe that a degree of privacy and understanding is essential if the Royal Highnesses are to provide a happy and secure upbringing for their children, while continue to give a wholehearted commitment to their public duties." That would be shocking. Because what does this mean for your world as a member of staff? If these people are separating, then what will become of this? Is it going to remain the status quo, or is this really the end of an era? Because in one sense, you'd almost want to be like, well, but they have been living as though they were separated. So that'll continue, will it not? No one was going to throw Diana into the street and be like, well, you're a woman of the world now, figure it out. Clearly, the palace was still going to take care of her. So if that's the case, was she still going to come by Charles's house because of the boys? I mean, you just wouldn't know what to expect as a member of staff. Wendy writes, "We sat in stunned silence until I said I needed a cigarette. I was going to go outside, but Maria and Lyda joined me at the table as we heard the series of statements by other politicians after the Prime Minister had finished. Within a few minutes, Jane Strathclyde arrived and handed us a copy of the statement for us to read ourselves. She looked very serious and subdued, and none of us realized at that time what further devastating news she had for all of us. She indicated that she wished to speak to Paul and Maria alone. Lyda and I went outside, but within seconds we could hear the terrible crying of Maria, obviously distraught by what Jane was telling her. "I don't want to go back to London," she sobbed. "What about our lives? We're all so happy here at Highgrove." Paul suddenly appeared at the kitchen door. He looked absolutely stunned by the conversation with Jane and said, "We're not wanted here anymore, Wendy. They don't need us anymore. Highgrove's going to be shut down and put into mothballs. I simply can't take it all in at one time." It was then my turn to go in and speak with Jane. I passed a still, emotional Maria, being led into the kitchen by Lita. Jane was distraught, on the verge of tears herself. She had had more than an hour of tears from Maria and looked absolutely drained. Just as a side note, Maria was living in complete and utter fantasy world. See, recall, Maria is married to Paul, right? And she used to work as, I believe, a maid in Buckingham Palace. But it didn't matter that Paul was living and aiding and caring for Princess Diana. She did not believe what anybody told her about Diana. She believed that Diana was this really lovely person and that Diana was probably just misunderstood and all of this. I don't understand how she came to that conclusion, but potentially since Paul was such good friends with Diana, he tended to see her in a more positive light and gave grace to all of her outbursts. I don't know. But it doesn't surprise me at all that Maria's over here shocked and, crying inexhaustibly for an hour, because she also wasn't attending to reality even as she lived in it. She was living in a fantasy world, believing that the people that her husband worked for were, lovely people and that they were just so lucky to work for these elite individuals. So, of course, this comes as a shock to her. Well, what's Wendy's news? Wendy, I'm very sorry to tell you that you are no longer required at Highgrove, said Jane. There's been a division of staff, and unfortunately, Highgrove will not be used that often by the prince or princess. Frances Simpson, the KP housekeeper, will travel with the prince since she is no longer required at Kensington Palace, and I'm afraid your job here will no longer exist. I did not know how to react, but I asked her what was going to happen to the casual staff. Jane told me that they would carry on as normal as and when they were needed, and that the division of staff only affected full-time people. I thanked her, still in a state of shock, and I went through the kitchen to comfort Maria, who was still crying hysterically. "How can they do this to us?" she screamed. "Just playing with people's lives! We made a home for ourselves here, and now it's all going to be turned upside down!" I'd been told that I would be paid up until July, but that I would have to be out of the lodge by then. I had spent 8 years there and was not looking forward to making another move. Like Maria, I felt slightly bitter that all of this had been thrust upon us and dreaded the upheaval in store. There would not have been any good time for such an announcement, but somehow the fact that it had been broken to us just a few weeks before Christmas exacerbated the shock and plunged us even further into depression. Yet the facade of togetherness still continued! Exclamation point. The next day, the prince and princess were together at Kensington Palace for the annual Christmas drinks party. And true to the rigid palace etiquette, the subject of the separation was not brought up by either Charles or Diana as they mingled with the dozens of guests. Both smiled nervously as they engaged people in conversation, thanking their staff for their help over the previous year. But as we took the coach home, the conversation naturally turned to the changes in store for us all. "I don't know how they can go through with something like that," marveled Paul. "It just didn't seem real." "Well, 'cause it's not real, Paul. You're right. It didn't seem real 'cause it wasn't. That glad handing and the smiling and the, let me get you another drink foolishness. What is the play act for? Who are we performing for? We are the audience and the cast members. So who exactly is watching this? Heaven and the angels? I mean, what is our point and purpose?" The Christmas was to be my last at Highgrove. The staff party had been organized at a London restaurant, and to my horror I found that I had been seated away from the main room. It was only then that I really understood the enormity of what had happened to me. Because I was due to leave, I had been sidelined, put on a small table in a side room where I could neither see anyone nor hear the speeches. Jane Strathclyde was by my side, but could see how disappointed I was not to be included in the principal party. On my left was the Highgrove orderly, David White, who, trying to be kind, said he felt sorry that I had been left out in the cold. It was difficult to accept what could only be deduced as a snub, and my whole evening was ruined by something as silly as a seating plan. Matters were made worse by Colin Trimming rushing in and telling a policeman at a table that he had managed to get him a place where the action was. I felt desperately miserable, unsure as to why I was being treated so badly. It was the final insult. On the one hand, you want to be like, well, get it together, Wendy. But on the other hand, if you had worked for 8 years from some people and you'd been close to them and taken care of their children and really made their house a home, and then because you're not going to be working for them next year because they decided to let you go, not because you did anything wrong, you're secluded to some little corner table away from where all the speeches are. Like, why did you even come to this party? You might as well just be eating at this restaurant alone for as much as you're involved in the party. Okay, that's the end of that chapter, and then we come to our final chapter. I know this has been a bit of a long episode, but we're almost done. This chapter is chapter 19. It's called Leaving Highgrove. I was not to see the Princess of Wales until early in the new year. Diana had decided to spend Christmas with her brother, Earl Spencer, at Althorpe, and had been forced to give up William and Harry for part of the holiday because Charles wanted them at Sandringham with the Queen. When the princess did eventually return to Highgrove on a dark, cold evening in January, it was with her sister Sarah, for a late-night raid of a few personal items in her room. Neither woman spoke to anyone that evening, and the visit was kept entirely secret apart from a notification to the police. They came under cover of darkness and went straight to Diana's sitting room, where the princess immediately packed up her photo albums, video collection, and those pictures small enough to carry back with her in the car. Larger items, such as her large charcoal and pencil drawings of an Edwardian lady, various watercolors, and drawings of Princes William and Harry and Earl Spencer, and several cushions from assorted settees, were put to one side ready for collection the following week. Diana left me a note explaining what she had taken, adding that she would be back in a few days for the larger items and several pieces of furniture. On January 12th, having taken William and Harry back to Ludgrove, she arrived shortly after 6 p.m., with Harold Brown, the K.P. butler, Paul Burrell, and her favorite interior designer, Dudley Polplock. Her detective, Dave Sharp, drove down with her, but remained quietly in the kitchen as we walked around the house, taking notes of which things were to go and which to stay. Diana had brought Dudley because he knew exactly which items belonged to her, which were joint wedding presents, and which were on loan from another royal house. She looked cool and composed as she went around Highgrove, a house that she would probably never set foot again in her life. Her tone was matter-of-fact as she said that she didn't really care about most of the things there and would not keep us long.
My main concern is for the boys, she repeated. As far as possible, I want everything to seem the same when they come here.
Okay, but Diana, if your main concern was the boys, none of this would be happening. I think the thing is, I'm just really sick of that line. She knows that's the line she's supposed to say as a concerned mother.
My main concern is for the boys.
But you can only say that so many times without people sort of like giving you the side eye, because your actions have to precede the words. Dudley looked miserable as he walked around the house. He had designed many of the rooms and was now aware that Charles had asked Robert Kim to redecorate the rooms.
Don't worry, Dudley. There will be plenty for you to do at Kensington Palace, said the princess, taking his arm. Now let's get down to business, shall we?
Every item that she intended to take back to London was written in a ledger book and photographed by Dudley with the Polaroid camera. As we walked briskly round the house, there were only a few things that Diana seemed adamant about having.
I've always loved that mirror in the drawing room, she said to me. Let's hope he'll let me have that.
There was a table that had come with her from Althorpe, and she decided to leave that for the boys as well. In fact, in an hour she had accumulated very little, choosing only to take a few vases and some cheap furniture that she had brought over from her flat in Coleherne Court before her marriage.
Now nobody can accuse me of stripping the place bare, can they?
She laughed lightly as we all went upstairs. Diana paused briefly before going into her room and took a deep breath. In the bright electric light, she looked around her, trying to remain detached and as unemotional as possible. Her eyes, however, betrayed her, and all of us knew she was choked with emotion. Well, I mean, who wouldn't be? It's a very emotional situation. It's very upsetting. No one's denying that this is a terrible situation. I really, in my cynicism, am not saying that I don't feel for everybody involved. It's just hard to feel sorry for people who find themselves in dreadful situations, knowing, as I said before, that they were the author of the script.
I'll take all these, please,
she said quietly to Dudley, pointing to the various photographs and pictures on her bathroom wall.
They're not valuable, but just personal things that he won't miss.
Snapshots of Diana and the boys, along with professional portraits of her around the world, were taken off the walls by Paul and Ken as she walked through the corridor.
Helena will come for my clothes, she told me. Don't worry about doing any of that stuff yourself, Wendy.
As we walked downstairs, I said how sorry I was about the separation. The princess stopped briefly and then looked me straight in the eye and said,
Don't be sorry, Wendy. It's all for the best in the long term, as I'm sure you know.
She added,
It's been very hard, but everything will turn out to be so much better for the boys in the end.
The princess said that we would see each other soon in London, and we walked through to her sitting room to wait for Paul and Harold to finish packing her car. The drawing room, previously decorated by Dudley Polplock, had been redone by Robert Kim, and Dudley asked if he could have a look at it. Yes, I see what's happening here, he murmured as I switched on the lamps. You can see this is an old man's room now. The prince is withdrawing into the womb. It's just like one of those rooms at Sandringham. You can see how he's regressing to childhood, what he's brought up with him. Dudley tutted quietly to himself as he looked at the new red curtains, a tapestry-covered sofa, and a marble-topped side table. Robert Kim, who had worked on the room for several months, had left the original light green walls but changed the carpet from green to a Hessian basket weave. "This room used to be so light and airy," Dudley said. "Now it's heavy and so oppressed." I turned off the lamps and accompanied him down the passage. "It's very sad, isn't it?" he said, gesturing towards the sitting room where Diana was sitting. "But she's being incredibly strong about things. I just hope she can maintain that fantastic composure." It's kind of easy to be strong about something when you orchestrated its end. It's not as though she has just lost somebody to a terrible tragic accident, one that she could never have foreseen coming. Her marriage has fallen apart because she has carefully pulled out, brick by brick, the foundation. And then when the house comes tumbling down, people are like, "Look how composed she is." Bravo! Bravo! If only she could maintain the composure. If only we could all be like that. And I'm like, well, I mean, she knew this was going to happen. She's not exactly a clairvoyant that, she was able to see into the future. She knew what was going to happen and she was able to steel herself. She's caused every mite of this. I thought about what the princess had told me as she pulled away in her car, taking the back drive exit rather than the front to avoid anyone seeing her. Her comment that it was perhaps for the best seemed right the more I thought about it, especially as far as William and Harry were concerned. I think she realized that eventually both children would have been irredeemably scarred by the continual tension and acrimony of her relationship with the prince. And I also think that she was beginning to recognize that, in the past, she'd been less than fair in the matter of Charles's access to his sons. Well, yes, that is true, but I mean, it's like now she got what she wanted. It's like as long as there was no separation, and she desperately wanted one, she was going to do anything she could to make him absolutely miserable, to force his hand at it. But then once she had the separation, she doesn't want the boys all the time. How's she going to carry on with her freedom if she's got those clingers on, So then it's like, all right, you can have your time with them because, I got boyfriends to see. "I suppose it'll be a straightforward division of time spent with the boys," said Paul as he locked the front door. "But you can bet anything you like the prince will want legal custody." Both of us walked back to the kitchen for one last cup of tea together. "What are you going to do, Wendy?" he asked. I told him I'd be paid up until July, but after that, I had no idea what was going to happen. Paul and Maria had been asked to go and work for the princess at Kensington Palace and would be moving later that spring. "They haven't treated you all that well, have they?" said Paul. "You know that Maria and I'll always be there for you if you need us." I thanked him for all his kindness, and I wondered what was going to happen to Highgrove in the light of Jane Strathclyde's comment that much of it was not going to be used anymore. But as I found out that Friday when she came to sort out my pension arrangements, much of what she had said had been misleading. Far from being closed down, it was merely undergoing a radical redecoration and a clear out of staff. "I'm sorry, Wendy, but I was told initially that the prince was not going to be spending nearly as much time here," she told me that afternoon. "Now, however, it looks as if he has changed his mind, and as you know, there's nothing new in that." She looked at me and laughed nervously. "There'll be lots of changes around here, and we wondered if you would like to work up to April and then vacate the lodge with a lump sum of 6 months' money." She added, "I should take it if I were you, because by law, we only have to give you 1 month's notice." I thanked her and asked if she would give me a few days to think about what I was going to do, but in the meantime I said that I'd stay at the lodge and continue to work as housekeeper, at least until they found a replacement for me. As I went down the main drive to the lodge that evening, I felt great waves of anger. I didn't blame Jane, because she was not capable of lying, but I did feel almost cheated. Why couldn't they have told me the truth in the first place? I thought to myself, why bother saying the house was being closed down when it wasn't? I decided to stay until April, and then take the lump sum offer. Well, I think I know why Charles did it. I think he wanted to get rid of anybody who had been staff when Diana was there, and anybody who he thought might have a loyalty to Diana, or anybody who had been witnesses to the fights. I think he just wanted a clear house, Paul is still working, but probably because Diana said she wanted Paul because Paul was sympathetic to her. Wendy had remained a bit agnostic as far as whose side she was going to take. So I think that it was easy to let Wendy go because she'd been a witness to all the crazy, and it's like nobody necessarily had like some big claim on her, so let her go. Paul, you and Diana seem to have a thing, so Diana, take Paul if you want Paul. But then everybody else was just going to get cut because, they'd seen too much and they needed a full, clean house. But they shouldn't have lied to her like that. It doesn't ever do any good to lie to people because they're going to find out anyway. Lying doesn't, I'm not saying anything you don't already know. But if you want a clean house and you want people who are new, who weren't here during all the strife, who weren't witnesses to all of it, if that's how you feel, then just say that. You know, and the person can take it how they're going to take it, you know. I'm not saying you have to say it in a mean way, but you can just explain, I need everything to change. And sadly and unfortunately, that includes our staff. But I want to make sure that you have a very fair pension. It's within his rights to let go anybody he wants to let go for whatever reason he wants to let them go. Unfortunately, when you lie to people, they end up feeling cheated. If he had just been forthcoming with it, they might not have liked it, but they could have at least respected that he told them the truth. But now we're getting angry, Wendy. And I don't know if it's from that place that she decided to write the book. She doesn't really describe in this book why she decided to write it. But if she feels like she was misused during her time and that she'd put up with a lot from them as they fight, you know, every day that they're there, the trauma, the tantrums, you know, the evil, vindictive nature of the whole thing. She put up a lot. She put up with them and put up with them and put up with them. Now we're coming to a stage in which things aren't so bad, you know? Things can get better. You two are separated. Maybe things will be easier. And now you're let go. It's like, well, I put up with all of that to just be let go in the end. Like, my life was a wreck, but I was there for you. I showed up every day. I did my job for you. Where is your gratefulness in any of that? Anyway, lying to a person isn't going to make them feel better. On Thursday, January 28th, the prince returned to Highgrove and walked through the front door as if nothing had changed in his life. He seemed buoyant and chatty, saying how glad he was to be back, and asking if I had had a good Christmas. Nothing was said about my having to leave, and the prince obviously felt confident that I would not mention it to him. Earlier that day, I had been sent a fax from his new rooms at St. James Palace listing the dates that he'd be spending at Highgrove over the next few months. The list showed that, far from leaving the house in mothballs, Charles was intending to spend more time than ever there. William and Harry were due to spend their first exit with their father, but not at Highgrove. Charles took Tigger and Rue with him, picked up the boys from school, and then departed for a secret destination. Paul said he'd heard from the princess that Charles had taken them somewhere in Norfolk and that Camilla had been in the house party. Nothing surprises me any more about that man, said Paul bitterly, as he came to collect his personal things from the pantry. In the light of what's happened, I simply cannot believe that he has the nerve to do something like that. Paul was talking about the recent newspaper revelations of a taped conversation between the prince and Camilla Parker Bowles, which provided evidence of an affair between them. During the conversation, the prince and Camilla discussed secret rendezvous and talked explicitly about their lovemaking. The disclosure seemed to do little to embarrass the prince, who seemed as cheerful and resilient as ever. The only effect the Camilla Gate tape had on him was a tightening up of a telephone security at Highgrove. On Tuesday, February 2nd, British Telecom came to put another private secret line in the main bedroom, which was being permanently used by Charles now that the princess had moved out. Despite all the previous publicity, they did not have the correct wiring, however, which led to a stern rebuke from Michael Fawcett, the prince's valet. They knew exactly what they had to do with the scrambler phone, yet wouldn't even get the right wires here, he cursed to me that evening. No wonder we have all these terrible breaches of security. Paul and Maria, meanwhile, had gone down to London to join the princess, their departure from Highgrove treated with the utmost glee by the prince. See, that's what I'm saying. He wanted to get rid of people who were loyal to Diana. Paul had gone through to the prince's study to say goodbye and had been terribly upset by Charles' reaction. Apparently, the prince had barely looked up. Are you really surprised? Said Michael the following day as I told him how upset Paul had been. The prince knew how close Paul and Maria were to the princess and knew that they were on her side. He could see them chatting conspiratorially to her whenever his back was turned. When I originally asked him what was going to happen to the Burrells, the prince replied, "Who cares? I don't want people like that running around at Highgrove." The princess threw a drinks party on Thursday, February 4th at her apartments at Kensington Palace. I asked Charles permission to attend, even though I was meant to be on duty at Highgrove, and he scrawled, "Approved," on the note that I had left out for him. That evening, Diana was surrounded by friends and seemed bright and happy as she discussed where her work was going to take her over the next few months. She seemed concerned about me and asked if I had found somewhere to go, and looking worried when I told her I did not have any plans. The whole affair was informal and relaxed, completely different from the more regimented party given by Charles for Patty Whiteland's 80th birthday the following evening. The prince, who counted Patty as one of his longest-serving and most faithful servants, had said to me that he wanted everyone out within a couple of hours. "And anyway, I'm having the PTs round for dinner, so I want to have the house cleared by then." For someone as otherwise fastidious, the Prince of Wales had a very earthy sense of humor, something he had obviously inherited from his father. The following evening, he took Patty to a private supper and was presented with a fox's penis bone mounted on a silver pin. The prince loved the gift, a traditional fertility symbol, and pinned it to his lapel that Sunday as he waited for the King of Greece to arrive. King Constantine and Charles carefully inspected the present as they took drinks in the sitting room that evening, swapping lewd jokes about how much they would do with such good luck in that department. The prince, who had a fascination generally with bodily functions, and like Fergie, loved a good fart joke, wore the pin quite often until it was packed away by a quick-thinking valet, who was worried about how insensitive a public wearing of the gift might seem in the light of the recent marriage breakup. Surely he wouldn't have worn a silver fox's penis bone pinned to his lapel in a public scenario. Who knows, though? These people are wild. The prince's friends were concerned at how he was coping with all the publicity about the separation, but they need not have worried. Rarely had I seen Charles so relaxing carefree. Of course, the burdens of the world have slipped from his shoulders. The wench who had sought to strangle him with her long bony fingers has now ceased to plague him. Of course you'd be relaxed and carefree. The fact that his estrangement from Diana was now public allowed him to breathe again in his own house, content that the princess was not likely to appear unannounced and upset his routine. Naturally, nothing was ever said by Charles about the events of the last few months, but there was a certain optimism in his mood that suggested that he had now got over the shock of Diana's betrayal and the worst of the publicity. The redecoration of Highgrove continued apace, and there was daily visits from Robert Kim, who organized regular deliveries of furniture from the Buckingham Palace store and other royal residences for the prince to consider. The bookshelves in the princess's sitting room were ripped out and the walls stripped of any traces of Diana's influence. It looked very much as if the prince was purging himself of all traces of his wife, giving himself and Highgrove a new start after so many years of unhappiness. The clear-outs also extended to the storerooms and basements, which had gradually filled with official presents and other gifts sent to the royal couple since the last sort-out. "Burn it all," said Patty, as he struggled to dump a finely carved wooden rocking horse in the incinerator at the back of the house. "Those were my orders." I watched in horror as piles of beautifully made pieces of furniture were lobbed into the flames, along with the standard teddy bears and toys sent in from royal fans around the world for William and Harry. "You start royal service as a monarchist, but very quickly become a Republican," Paul had told me once. And he was right. It made me angry to see so many gifts and clothes go up in smoke, when so much could have been given away to charity or to the homeless. Oh, the furniture, the burning of the furniture. I mean, I could understand why Charles is like, what do we need all these stuffed animals for? I can only agree there, although I don't know if burning them's the right thing to do. But all the furniture, like, why are you burning up the good furniture? As somebody who hasn't had a couch in her living room for like 2 months because I can't find one that I like, I just feel really distraught at the loss of this furniture. The following week took the prince on a solo visit to America, where he was amazed and excited by his rapturous reception from the thousands of people who turned out to see him. While he was away, British Telecom came back to install yet more lines in the library and to fit another security phone in the prince's bedroom. These phones were theoretically impossible to tap or intercept. The prince was adamant that he wanted these, and not just normal landlines after the Camilla Gate saga. The phones traveled with Charles in a large case when he was in country and could be plugged into certain wall sockets. The fact that the prince had waited for Diana to leave before making these changes seemed perverse to us all. She says if he had taken such care in previous years, none of the tapes could have been made. Charles, despite being a colonel-in-chief of several regiments and a reasonably intelligent man, had no idea about personal security, needing constant reminders from his personal staff about the most basic areas. The newspapers had been full of royal bugging stories for weeks, and even in the fallout from the tape scandals, Charles was surprised when it was suggested his personal rooms should be swept for listening devices. In the last few weeks, everyone had been under suspicion, getting late-night visits from Royal Protection Squad officers asking us if we knew anything about who had been behind the recent revelations. Diana's personal line was cut off at Highgrove on the prince's orders, and after that, there was very little evidence left of the Princess of Wales at the house. Her presence finally extinguished, Charles settled down to entertain his close circle of friends for weekend house parties and small dinner parties. Larger duchy lunches for 14 or more people were juggled with visits from the prince's advisors. Camilla Parker Bowles was not on the guest list, and nobody was able to work out if he was still seeing her in private. We were convinced that Charles was incapable of breaking off all contact, and were intrigued as to what was happening with their relationship. My hunch was that they were still speaking regularly on the secrecy phones, especially during the long Sunday evenings at Highgrove, when the prince would retire into his library for hours on end. On March 12th, with the house almost finished, Emily Van Cutsum arrived for the weekend. She found the new rooms very exciting, and wandered around upstairs marveling at the prince's good taste. Mrs. Van Cutsum was waiting for her son Edward to arrive by train from Durham University, both of them having been invited by the prince to spend the weekend with him, William, and Harry. "The poor boys," said Emily conspiratorially to me. "They must have been through so much." Edward Van Cutsum was by now in his late teens and had worked for a spell in the office at Buckingham Palace between school and university. The prince liked him and enjoyed having him round when the boys were at home. "Edward is so good with the young princes," cooed Mrs. Van Cutsum, who now seemed to be taking on something of a maternal role in the boys' upbringing. "He gives them someone to look up to as a role model." She had brought her son's gun with her, and that weekend Edward, William, and Harry went out together shooting rabbits. They came back late on Saturday afternoon with at least a dozen, and William and Harry excitedly recounted how they had both shot one each. Charles looked on contentedly and asked for the exact details of where and how they had made the kills. But this next part is, shocking, and people should have been way more upset about what had happened. I think Wendy was pretty annoyed by this, but everybody else is, acting like it's just the cutest, and, oh, what a funny thing, thank goodness. Nothing bad happened, but I'm sitting here going, what? I don't understand the cavalier attitude that he takes here. She says the next day both boys went out all morning with Edward for another shooting expedition. Unfortunately, I very nearly got caught in the crossfire. Has nobody taught these people about gun safety? As I was walking back to the lodge after clearing up the breakfast things, I heard a shot go off above my head. Darting for cover, I came across the prince walking around the side of the house with Emily Van Cutsum, chuckling at the near miss. He strode purposefully round the front of the house and shouted, "Hold your fire, men! Wendy wants to get home!" "No!" shrieked William in fits of laughter. "Not until a forfeit's been paid!" "I'm out of money, but I'll pay later," I shouted back, letting the prince walk me gingerly down the drive. "Bloody hooligans," he laughed. "Well, at least take some comfort from the fact that they'll get me as well as you if they start taking pot shots." What kind of a gun is this? Is this a BB gun? I mean, maybe that's why it's all just ha ha ha, ho ho ho, Wendy almost got shot in the head. But this seems kind of not the way we should be dealing with guns. Neither child mentioned their mother once that weekend and seemed perfectly contented to join in with the prince and his party, which included the Palmer Tompkinsons. Emily Van Cutsum seemed surprised at how resilient they were and said cozily to me, "I think things will really work out for them. They don't seem at all affected by everything, thank God." It was to be my last week at work, and with the prince going abroad that Monday afternoon, time to say goodbye. I was walking through the library with his snack bag of orange, milk, and cream, bags of wheat germ, linseed, prunes, and sultanas, which he would take with him on the way to the airport, when suddenly Patty burst into the room in front of me. There had been another disaster. Prince Harry's pony had just broken his leg in the paddock and would need to be destroyed. "Oh, God," said the prince. "There's always something dying on me," before seeing him out of the room. Then, going over to his desk, he produced a leather-bound photograph of himself in a small silver box embossed with the Prince of Wales feathers, and held out his hand. Standing there in his uniform, with his blue eyes shining and his teeth flashing white, he went through the same speech that he must have made on hundreds of such occasions. "Thank you so much, Wendy, for all your hard work," he said with a smile. And then he went on to say that he knew it wasn't much of a parting present, but that he always wanted her to know that he had really appreciated her at Highgrove. And then they talked for a few minutes about her family and what plans that she had for in the future. And then he said, come back to St. James whenever you want, come visit me and all this, all these little words that you really can't rely on. She goes on to say that the following Friday, I went into the house for one last time to say goodbye to the staff. Mrs. Van Cutsum had arrived for the weekend, and after saying farewell to her, I joined Chris and the others in the dining room for bottles of wine and champagne. I looked around the room at the policemen and the valets who'd been part of my life for so many years and felt quite overcome with emotion. Despite all the upheavals and traumas, all the rows and petty jealousies, I was sorry to be leaving. A group of us walked down to the lodge where we continued to party until dawn, which shocked me because Wendy is well into her 60s. And I was like, wow, partying till dawn, Wendy. The princess rang several days later to invite me for a farewell lunch at San Lorenzo, her favorite London restaurant. Meeting for drinks at Kensington Palace shortly after midday on Monday, April 26th, about 10 of us then took cars down to the restaurant at Beauchamp Place and were astonished to see that we had been given a private room upstairs. "Look at you, so thin," said the Italian owner, the kindly and talkative Mara Barini, as she pinched Diana's arm. "Now, what are you going to eat?" Ken Wharf was there, as were Mervyn, the chef, Paul and Maria and Helena, the dresser. A group of people from the office filled the rest of the places round the large table with me at the center and the princess to my left. Paul seemed on edge that day, whispering conspiratorially to me that the princess was not speaking to him any more as we took our places. Things went downhill pretty bad for old Paul. But as far as I was concerned, she seemed on tremendous form, laughing and joking with Ken and filling me in on the latest household gossip. Diana's staff had taken great care to organize the lunch, but as we were running out of time, the princess decided to skip the main course of veal and move straight from the pasta starter to the pudding. As a result, there was no main course for anyone, since everyone traditionally kept pace with her. How disappointing. I would have been devastated. What? Just the pudding? I mean, as much as I like that, let's not let anything go to waste here. Finally, it was time for coffee, and at that moment a specially made cake was brought out and bottles of champagne opened. The princess, giggling at something Ken had just said, got up to thank me, handing me a small enamel box and a signed picture of herself.
For your collection, she laughed, before whispering quietly into my ear, as you go out into the real world.
Diana, her female detective, left a few minutes later for an appointment, leaving the rest of us to carry on enjoying ourselves at the restaurant. Some of the company broke into song as the day wore on. Ken and the other policemen talked candidly about how life had changed since the separation. Well, she seems to have started to get what she wants, said one of them, talking about the princess. Yes, agreed Ken, his florid complexion deepening with the wine. But where is it all going to end? And that's where we end, and that's where this book ends. And, of course, we, unfortunately, do know how that all ended and what a tragedy it is that her life ended the way that it did. Well, that was a pretty intense book as far as the revelations that we gleaned. I think that it was probably one of the most honest tellings of the truth that we have received. And I appreciate, like I said at the beginning, that I feel like Wendy really didn't spend a whole lot of time trying to insert her own personal feelings. Of course, we got Wendy's vibe. She let us know how she felt about things. And I'm not saying she was any shrinking violet about some of the things she shared. But I do feel like there was less of a cutting, caustic undertone to the retelling of the story, so I appreciated that. And I think that most of you guys appreciated it too. Now, the Kennedy book starts this week, and also for those of you who have been enjoying the Mountbattens, I know that's been 2 weeks. I haven't had an episode out on them yet, but don't worry, we're going to restart our regular programming of Mountbattens on Sundays, and then a different book during the week. So if you've been missing the Mountbattens, or you think that I just stopped doing it, I haven't. It's just been kind of crazy. This vacation that we took down to Birmingham and then down to the beach has just kind of set my schedule off a little bit, but don't worry, we'll get back to regular scheduled programming at least by this Sunday. So, all right, I'll see you guys later, and thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. Bye.